least not our regular staff, because this is primarily a staff seminar, but due to, I guess, a popular response, please do come down, everyone down the front. We're still trying to run a seminar here rather than a lecture. Due to the popularity of the response to the call, we had to move down here away from our normal seminar setting. So thank you all for coming. Today we're very lucky to welcome John Landis, a legendary director of Hollywood movies such as Animal House and Blues Brothers. Sorry, John, you probably heard that a million times.
I actually stayed at the same hotel in LA with the director once.
Oh, wow.
And I got his calls, and I assume he got mine. And his were a lot more interesting.
Right, so you had a lot of meetings with Hollywood hotshots and stuff to deal with. Now, John D. Landis, our guest today, is, of course, the Crossways Professor, which I'm curious about. You'll have to tell us what the Crossways
I have no idea.
You don't even know what it is, okay.
No.
And Department Chair of City and Regional Planning at the University of Pennsylvania. And he's with us this semester as he's on sabbatical, and so he's a visiting scholar in our faculty. And John's research, as he's going to tell you about, is concerned with a range of questions in urban and regional planning related to housing affordability, the process of neighbourhood and urban change, and he undertakes that research through a series of quantitative methods, which he'll also talk to you about today. The question he posed for today's lecture I found fascinating. I've been grappling with how to interpret the meaning of urban change in Washington, DC, and how to, I suppose, assess that process of change in some work I've been doing. And coming across this exact same problem of this almost present obsession with and sort of critical attitude towards the gentrification process, especially in the mainstream press. And it's very difficult to grapple with, because on the one hand, it's basically the story of success, which cities were trying to achieve for decades as everyone run their hands at the urban crisis. But of course, it's introduced its own problems. But I think one of the things that's concerned me is that the obsession with, I suppose, gentrification, as opposed to simply the wider question of affordability, that seems to exercise the minds of columnists. So I'm really curious to hear how your data plays out. So thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. My wife and I have been in Sydney since January 1. We were here 10 years ago on sabbatical. Never been to Australia before that, but I feel like I was born to live in Australia. It's a wonderful place. It has three or four things that I think are just world class and no other place has. The first is it has the world's best flat white coffees, which I came to like 10 years ago and can't get anywhere else in the world. And you know, when you go to Italy and they say, you know, a cappuccino is as good as a flat white. No, it's not. And then you have the world's nicest dogs. My wife and I live in Glebe, and every morning and every afternoon we take about a 3 or 4 kilometer walk along the Glebe foreshore, where we are joined by an incredible number of dogs off leash, who are all just so nice. And so, you know, and in America they're all on leash and they're all waiting to bite you or something like that. But here, and lastly, you don't have Donald Trump. Okay? So in America, you turn on the TV and Donald Trump is on every channel and he fills up the TV screen. And I think we've only seen him once on TV here, and it's just such a delight not to have to see Donald Trump. Anyway, I became interested in this issue of gentrification and neighborhood change about 10 years ago, because exactly as you said, it seems like people were complaining about what was a rare success. At least in America, less so in Australia, but in America and in the UK, certainly the decade between the 1940s and the 1990s was a period in which the central cities were emptying out. They were losing their economic vitality, they were losing their population, they were losing their economic base. And so in the early and then there were a few periods in the 1970s in America where people thought there was an urban revival, but it really didn't happen. So when the urban revivals happened for real in the United States, starting in the 1990s, and young people, creative types, but older people as well, started coming back to the central city, and people started complaining about it. it seemed to me odd. It seemed to me that we should welcome this sort of reinvestment in center city neighborhoods, and yet instead of celebrating it, people were complaining about it. And it's even odder from a theoretical perspective because, as I'll talk to you a little bit about today, gentrification or neighborhood upgrading. Instead of calling it gentrification, let me call it urban neighborhood upgrading. I'll define gentrification a little bit later as a subset of that. But urban neighborhood upgrading is as close as you get to a win-win solution as there is in urban change. On the one hand, there's a clear group of losers from neighborhood upgrading, and that is low-income renters. I mean, when you get neighborhood upgrading, rents go up, and that makes it harder for existing low-income renters to stay in their neighborhoods. So there's a clear group of losers. But there are typically many, many, many more winners. Okay, the existing homeowners, existing businesses, new homeowners, new young people, and cities, frankly, need constant reinvestment in order to stay alive and stay vital. So the city itself is a winner, and so this sets up the potential for what economists call a Pareto improvement, which is to say, that the winners could compensate the losers, and if they did that, everybody would be better off. So, this whole idea of urban upgrading creates a situation where a lot of people are much better off and a few people are much worse off, but you could easily think of various systems to make everybody better off, okay, by sort of sharing some of the benefits of upgrading. But instead of talking about that potential, certainly in America, certainly in the UK, I can't speak about it in Australia, people said, no, because there are a few losers, we have to stop this, or we have to control or to limit this process of urban upgrading. So it seemed to me that not only were we seeing success in our urban policies, maybe it wasn't due to what we were doing, it was just due to changes in demographics and other things like that, but from a clear theoretical perspective, we had a chance to really make people better off who otherwise wouldn't be better off, and we weren't taking it. And lastly, I became interested in this issue of gentrification because it seemed throughout my life I had lived in places that were once had really a lot of problems and now were much, much improved. I grew up outside New York City, and when I got my when do you get driver's license? 17. Well, in the U.S. it was 16, at least it was back then. And when I turned 16, I got my driver's license, and I lived in Westchester County, which is a northern suburb of New York City. I would drive down to the Bronx, which was about the worst place there was, and see the New York Yankees play. Okay, and I would go at night games, and my parents' car wasn't the most reliable, so one night I drove down and went to see the game. The Yankees are a baseball team. That probably doesn't mean anything to you. If they were a cricket team, it might, I suppose. I drove down and I saw the game. It was a good game, and then the car broke down after the game, and I called my parents, and this was before they didn't have cell phones. Then you actually had to go, and find a phone on the street and put money in it. It sounds like a strange thing to do. And called my parents, and they said, go back to the car, lock, raise the windows, lock it, don't do anything, and we'll come down and get you. You just don't want to be in this area called the Bronx. And now if you go back to the same area, it's actually quite marvelous. And then when I was in graduate school, I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area, and this was in the late 70s, and there were many districts in Oakland and in San Francisco which were similar to the Bronx. They were just, terrible. And you didn't want to go in them, and if you went in them, you didn't want to stay in them very long. And then over the course of the next 20 years, I've seen these places just become just absolutely marvelous. And so, and now most recently, when I was here, in 10 years ago in Glebe, it was every third or fourth house needed some substantial improvement. Now 10 years later, off Glebe Point Road, it's just great. Now, I think if you're a student and you have to pay rent, you probably don't see it quite that great. But for the most part, these cities are much better off. Their populations are much better off. And as I said before, this has created the potential to share the wealth and to create populations to help populations which normally don't get to participate in urban prosperity to do so. And yet, when we look at the popular press, which, so in America right now, the popular press, or the mainstream press, is headquartered in New York, and then the digital internet press is headquartered in San Francisco. So maybe, and they're constantly complaining. I don't know if we can get those lights off. We're sort of stuck with them. Okay, so this thing up upper right is the infamous Google bus. I don't know if you've heard of the Google bus, but the Google bus is, it turns out that all the young hipsters who work in Silicon Valley, they don't want to live in Silicon Valley, which they want to live in San Francisco. San Francisco is about 40 miles north of Silicon Valley. So Google, wanting to employ all these young hipsters, it started its own bus service. So every morning it picks them up in San Francisco, and then they can get on the bus and they sit in traffic, and they, an hour later they're in Silicon Valley. And so they get, all these young hipsters get to live in San Francisco, where they are gentrifying all the neighborhoods and causing rents to go up and causing people to be displaced. And people are getting very upset about this. So they said, oh, you know what we'll do? We'll nip this in its bud by preventing the Google buses from leaving. So they formed a human chain around the Google buses in the morning to prevent the Google buses from leaving, figuring out that would cause the hipsters to leave San Francisco and cause everything to go back the way it was. Unfortunately, they failed to reconcile with the fact that was illegal, and secondly, all the hipsters have laptops and things like that, so they thought it was pretty cool to work on the bus. It didn't work, but I thought so the Google bus has become sort of the epitome of opposition to gentrification, even though it's crazy. Here is where I used to live, Oakland, California, now called Brooklyn by the Bay. Oakland just, couldn't catch a break for 50 years, and now, it's become a very vital place. And then finally, I mentioned that area that happened 40 years ago when I was a little younger, where my car broke down the South Bronx, which is now becoming, what was once upon a time probably the most godforsaken place in America. Now it's really gentrifying. So, and of course, New York and San Francisco are where the internet and the print press are. And of course, everybody in the UK has been talking about gentrification for 50 years. Of course, Ruth Glass coined the term gentrification to talk about Islington, which is a sort of, you'd call it an inner suburb of central London, in 1964. Here's a more recent map of gentrification hotspots, and it turns out that, at least in the UK, if you want to know where gentrification is going to occur, figure out where all the 23-year-old students are going to be, and that's that map, and everybody's talking about it in the UK. And then here, I just pulled this off your press, the internet, yesterday. Apparently, people are talking about it here, and over there is, and now, to my eye, Newtown hasn't gentrified very much in the last 10 years. But I guess technically it has, at least according to Sydney Morning Herald. And I don't know what the image on the left has to do with gentrification, except it was in their headline. And I just love the idea that there was a media called the Big Smoke. And so maybe somebody can explain to me what the Big Smoke is. I've never heard of it. Have any of you ever heard of it? Okay. Anyway, what?
That building is serious, John.
It is.
It's a public housing building.
Okay. Yeah. So it's a big issue here as well, even though I've never heard of the Big Smoke. So the question is, at least the question I'm interested in answering, a number of questions. And I'll get to the forum in a minute. But is this an issue that's just limited to a few hot cities where the media happen to be, and reporters, rather than go out and chase a story, they'd like stories to come to them. So if they can look at their window, or more likely, a lot of reporters are renters. If their landlord raises the rent on them, they can write an easy story on gentrification. If in this internet age, it gets spread. So is this a real issue that affects a lot of people in a serious way, or is it just sort of an easy news story in San Francisco, New York, Washington, D.C., Sydney, and London? Because I would argue that if it's an easy news story in a few big cities, a real news story, but an easy news story in a few big cities, let's focus on those cities. On the other hand, if it's a national problem, or it's a metropolitan problem in many areas, we've got to think about it from a much different sort of policy perspective. So, having said that, I'm just going to go through that. There's a very nice website put out by an American online journal called Next City, which explains the history of gentrification over 50 years. It's got a U.S. bias, and it's really a lot of fun to go through. Here's Ruth Glass talking about gentrification in 1964, and it's really those of you who teach housing policy or teach community development. This is really a wonderful website for sort of exploring the history of gentrification. So I'm gonna walk through the answers. I'm gonna ask 4 questions, and then I'm gonna walk through the answers to them, and then I'm going to come up with some policy implications, mostly that apply in the United States. The first is gentrification something that's fundamentally different from neighborhood upgrading? Is it something that's different from neighborhood upgrading, or is it a subset of neighborhood upgrading and neighborhood decline? Okay, so is it just a particular version of neighborhood change, or is it a unique version of neighborhood change? And how would we answer that question? Well, we'd have to be able to measure gentrification. Okay? And so my first task is going to be to come up with some measures of neighborhood change, including measures of gentrification, that I can apply over many different metropolitan areas to see what's going on. So to have a common definition and then do apples to apples to apples comparisons over the 70 largest metropolitan areas in America. So to find out, well, what is this thing, and is it happening everywhere, or is it happening in a few places? That's the first thing I'm going to do. I'm going to count neighborhood change. I'll show you how I do that. And then the question is, once we've counted it, what's driving it? Now, from a theoretical perspective, there's sort of 2 arguments about neighborhood change in general. And when I say neighborhood change, I mean neighborhood decline, which are things are getting worse, and I mean neighborhood upgrading, things are getting better. So there are 2 sort of general theories. The first is sort of a macroeconomic theory, which says it depends on the economy of a region. Okay, so if the region of Sydney is doing, if the Sydney greater metropolitan region of Sydney is doing better, that is, it's growing in terms of population, it's growing in terms of investment, it's growing in terms of its economy and innovation, that's going to raise all boats, and a lot of neighborhoods are going to share in that increase in prosperity. So the story of neighborhood change is really a story of regional improvement that telescopes down to a few neighborhoods, or maybe many neighborhoods. That's one argument, and so I want to see, is that true? Okay? Is the story of neighborhood upgrading or decline a regional story or a metropolitan story? The second argument, which has been made by a critical geographer who passed away a few years named Neil Smith, says no, it's not really that at all. Where gentrification occurs, it's because capital, or basically a few developers, get together and take advantage of very low real estate prices in a particular neighborhood or in a particular set of neighborhoods. So they sort of create a cartel in a particular set of neighborhoods that have a potential, have a lot of value associated with them, mostly by virtue of their close location to the CBD. And they basically arrange to drive out the existing tenants, upgrade the physical building stock a little bit, welcome new tenants in, and rent those improved houses to the new tenants, to the new buyers at a much greater price. So essentially, gentrification or neighborhood change happens from the bottom up by a bunch of entrepreneurial, or you might call them entrepreneurial, or other people might call them overly ambitious, or other people might call them blood-sucking developers. So is this neighborhood change process, this neighborhood gentrification process, is it primarily a top-down process, or is it a bottom-up process? And I want to see if I could figure that out. And then lastly, I wanted to take on really the hardcore question, which is gentrification good or bad? Okay? Or is neighborhood change good or bad? Which is to say, is there displacement that goes along with this? So the way that people think about gentrification is it's a socio-economic upgrading. So it's new wealthy residents replacing old poorer residents. That's one dimension. The second is it's a housing stock upgrading. Those new wealthier residents want nicer housing, and usually the commercial services that go with it. And the third is that the first 2 processes push out or displace the poorer residents. Okay? And those 3 pieces are usually a part of the gentrification puzzle. Income upgrading, physical upgrading, and displacement. And some people would say if you only have, you know, if you have two of them and one is displacement, that's gentrification. So the obvious question is, you know, in these places where gentrification is occurring, are you seeing higher rates of displacement? Now, displacement's really hard to measure, and I actually don't measure it, but I measure something related called turnover. So that's the fourth question. Are rates of turnover higher in places that we see are gentrifying? Because if they're not, okay, if rates of turnover are lower in gentrifying neighborhoods, then again, it's pretty easy to sort of figure out how to deal with the low-income renter problem, okay? It's just that we have a few people in some neighborhoods who are substantially disadvantaged by this process, and we can figure out ways to help them stay in the neighborhood, or if they actually want to leave the neighborhood, and some might, to help them do so without a huge loss. Okay? So, you know, so I set out to answer these 4 questions, and I'll share the answers with you today. So the first question, and here they are. So let's start with the first one first. Can we come up with a robust approach to measuring gentrification and other types of neighborhood socioeconomic change across all U.S. metropolitan areas? This is pretty, and I want to do so at the neighborhood level, not at the city level, but at the neighborhood level. And in the U.S., we have things called census tracts, which are about, they're spatial units defined by the Census Bureau. They range in a size from about 3,000 to 8,000 people. Depending on where they are, and that's how our census is enumerated by depending on what census tract you live in. There's only one problem. I wanted to look from the period 1990 to 2000. 2010, and over that 20-year period, a lot of the census tract boundaries change. So if you're comparing people in one set to people in a later set, if the boundaries change, that makes that comparison pretty hard. The second comparison that I wanted to do is the second sort of problem is that I wanted to look at primarily income to see whether people's incomes were going up or down, but incomes are changing more broadly across cities and across the country during this period. So if you saw people's income in a particular neighborhood going up, was that going up in that neighborhood, or is it growing up in the city, or is it going up in the country? How to do that? And it turns out that the method of deciles solves a bunch of these problems. So here's how we did it. So I would look at the median income in each census tract in a city. To let you know, New York City has about 5,000 census tracts. So that's a lot of census tracts. So I looked at the median income in each of those tracts in 1990 and 2000 in each of those tracts. So let's take a look at tract number 101, an example tract. So in 1990, tract 101 would have had a median income of $17,000, okay? That is, the middle income in that tract in 1990 would have had a median income of $17,000, okay? And that median income would have put it in the third income decile. So that sort of continuum shows you we break down median income within each metropolitan area into deciles, and that income of $17,000 in 1990 would have meant that tract 101 is in the third decile, okay? Let's come back to tract 101 in 2010, and we see by 2010, the median income has gone up to $42,000, which is quite a big increase, actually, $17,000 to $42,000. And that's elevated that same tract 101, from the third decile to in this case, the fifth decile. Okay? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say that any tract that moves up 2 or more deciles of income over those 20 years, and that's a lot, actually, okay? A bunch of people getting a raise every year is not going to move a tract income up, okay? It really does require the arrival of a lot of new people who are richer. So if a tract moves up by 2 or more deciles over 20 years, we're going to call that neighborhood upgrade, okay? And at the bottom, you can see if a tract moves down by 2 or more deciles, there's tract 110, which in 1990 had an income of $45,000. By 2010, its income had gone down to $42,000. So its decile status had gone from 9 to 5, okay? So if a tract moves down 2 or more deciles, I'm going to call the neighborhood decline. Median household income, okay? So the nice thing about this is that if I can get these tracts in 1990, and I can get them in 2010, and I can put them I can sort them in each of their metropolitan areas. I can do this for every every metropolitan area in America. And I did it for the top 70. So I came up with what I think is a pretty robust definition of neighborhood upgrading and neighborhood decline. This approach has some advantages. It's reasonably straightforward. It makes good use of the data. The use of deciles rather than averages turns out to be convenient and robust. It avoids having to track housing occupancy and quality changes, which is hard. One of the problems in America, I don't know if you're having this problem in Australia, is in the 1990s, they tracked housing quality very well, but housing quality was so high that they really, there weren't very many poor quality houses anymore after 1990, and they just stopped tracking it. So it's really hard to get a good measure of housing quality in the U.S., good local measures. And then lastly, using this double decile, Tract has to go up by 2 or more, or down by 2 or more. It distinguishes big changes from small changes. There's some downsides to this. It lacks subtlety. I said before that gentrification is both a physical improvement in stock and an improvement in the income of the occupants, and this just measures income. It doesn't deal with occupancy or housing quality changes. It doesn't consider the starting points, and it really doesn't look at absolute changes in wealth. So, if your income went up from $30,000 US to $40,000 US, maybe you didn't go up in terms of deciles, but that's still a lot more income. So it really doesn't consider absolute changes. Now, how do we think about gentrification? I just sort of arbitrarily said, if you went up by 2 or more deciles over 1990 to 2010, and you started in 1990 in the first, second, third, or fourth decile. So if you were a Tract that started poor in 1990 and you went up by 2 or more deciles, we're going to call that gentrification. And it so happens that this is a useful definition because starting in the first 4 deciles conforms exactly to the US definition of low-income housing. Okay? In America, if you were in the 80% income bracket of your metropolitan area or lower, you are eligible for affordable housing. Okay? So that doesn't mean you're going to get it. It just means you're eligible. Okay? So we talk about a neighborhood moving from a low-income neighborhood 2 or more up. Now that means you can move from 1 to 3 or 1 to 5. It means you can move from 2 to 7. It means you can move from 2 to 4, depending on where you start off and where you end up. Okay. And then we did this for both central city locations and suburban locations, and then we had to deal with this issue of the fact that the census tract boundaries themselves were changing. So we did some clever GIS work by decomposing each tract into grid cells, and then looking at the changes in grid cells and taking the old grid cells and pouring them into the new geography. And that actually worked pretty well too. So this is how we did that. And so here's some 3 places: central Boston, central San Francisco, and central Seattle. They don't show gentrification. It just shows the spatial distribution of upgrading neighborhoods, those that rose by 2 or more deciles, declining neighborhoods, those that declined by 2 or more neighborhoods. There's that San Francisco, and there's central Seattle. One of the things you can see from Boston is that there doesn't seem to be any spatial clustering of decline and upgrading. Similarly in Seattle, there doesn't seem to be any spatial clustering of decline or upgrading, where you see a clear spatial pattern in San Francisco. Most of the places were upgrading, except for a few arcs of decline. So total this up, and let's sort of figure out how big were these phenomena. So if we divided it up, metropolitan areas up into core areas and suburbs, and you have this. I'll just tell you that what you call the inner suburbs in America would be core. Okay, at least here in Sydney. I guess you have. Is it true that you have the CBD and everything else is a suburb? I mean, it's pretty much the way it is, right? So Paddington is a suburb, Darlinghurst is a suburb, Glebe is a suburb. And in America, those would be part of the core areas, okay? Just to let you know. So if we ask, what share of the population of these 70 largest metropolitan areas in 1990 lived in these neighborhoods that were going to change over the next 20 years, 2.3% of the core area of the population of the metropolitan area lived in core area upgrading. Only 1.4% of the metropolitan population lived in neighborhoods that would gentrify over the next 20 years, whereas 3.8% lived in neighborhoods that were declining. Now, if we go out to the suburban areas, which here in Sydney would be 10, 20, 30 kilometers out, actually it was very interesting. A little more, there was actually suburban upgrading going on. Suburbs were changing. It wasn't just the center city. Suburbs are gentrifying, okay? But suburbs were declining as well. And the reason we saw so much suburban decline in the U.S. is that was sort of the locus of the the mortgage meltdown and the global financial crisis. It mostly happened in a bunch of suburban single-family home neighborhoods. This simple tabulation suggests that at least between 1990 and 2010, I'll show you some later numbers a little bit later, gentrification was not, and again, this is the 70 largest metropolitan areas, including probably every metropolitan area most of you would think of. Gentrification of those people living in the core would affect at the maximum only about 1.5% over the next 10 years. In the suburbs, about 1.5%. A far bigger problem, particularly in the suburbs, was neighborhood decline. Neighborhoods in the suburbs were getting poor. So I thought this is pretty useful, and it puts it into a nice context of what's the real magnitude of these changes. Neighborhood decline was, depending on where you were, was somewhere between 3 and, at least in this period, a phenomenon was occurring 3 or 5 times as much as neighborhood upgrading. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. So that's sort of the first question. And here were just, these are just sort of fun facts. Here were the leaders in terms of metropolitan areas who had the most of these things. These are the core areas. So Seattle, between 1990 and 2010, had the most upgrading. And some places we don't normally think of. Columbia, South Carolina. Anybody been to Columbia, South Carolina? I've never been there. I've been to most of the places. I've never been there. San Francisco Bay Area is on the list. New Orleans is on the list. Stockton, California. I spent a lot of time there. I would never have thought of upgrading there. Here's the gentrifying leaders. Again, Columbia, South Carolina. This is as a percentage of the metropolitan population, not absolute. Tampa, Seattle, Stockton. So the interesting thing was, gentrification and upgrading is not as common as people say it is. First rule of policy analysis is just because people say something's a problem doesn't mean it's a problem. And this sort of demonstrates that. Gentrification upgrading wasn't as common in terms of magnitude as people said it was. Second, it was actually more widespread, even though it wasn't a big phenomenon. And then third, decline was a much bigger problem, at least socioeconomic decline during this period. And lastly, take a look at the top gentrifier. 20% of Columbia's, South Carolina's population was in neighborhoods that would gentrify. Look at the magnitude of Las Vegas, which was the leading decliner. You can see 60% of Las Vegas' population in 1990 lived in neighborhoods that would, by my definition, decline. So it gives you some sense of what's going on in different places. So that was the first question. The first answer to the first question. This is a widespread phenomenon, neighborhood change. The decline part of it's much bigger, at least during this period, and gentrification, upgrading, or at least during this period, are not a big phenomenon. Even though they're widespread, they're not particularly big, at least as I've defined it. So the second thing I want to do is find out, is what's happening a function of metropolitan or regional economies, or is it a function of a bottom-up process? And I'm not going to bore you too much with the results, other than to say I ran a bunch of regression models looking at the percentage of the population in each of these metropolitan areas that lived in each of these neighborhood types and tried to figure out what factors were correlated with higher or lower percentages. And let's just look at the core areas. And we can see that the only factor that was associated with consistently with core upgrading was the presence of an urban containment line. Okay? The low characteristics of the metropolitan population, the characteristics of the metropolitan economy, those didn't matter. Okay? I looked at like 50 or 60 measures. The only thing that affected the percentage of people who lived in upgrading core areas was whether there was an urban containment line, what you would call a greenbelt, around the metropolitan areas. If we looked at gentrification, again, the presence of an urban containment line seemed to push levels of gentrification up. The greater percentage of white populations seemed to push gentrification levels down. And if we looked at core area declining neighborhoods, we could see that the thing pushing decline, making more neighborhoods decline, was just general growth. The more growth you had during this period, the more likely you were to decline. So you saw Las Vegas at the top of that list of decline. Las Vegas was also the fastest growing metropolitan area in America during this period. So the more growth you had, the more decline you had, actually. And there's some other factors there as well. And then we did the same thing for suburban areas. And this is all based on an article that came out this year in the Housing Policy Debate. If you want to see the full models, you can see it. The other thing is that we could do a much better job predicting decline from metropolitan areas than we can predicting upgrading. Notice the R-squared measures are much lower. You can see for the core area, the R-squared is only 0.19 on a 0 to 1 scale, whereas for decline, it's 0.44. So this suggests that neighborhood decline, at least as I've measured it, does reflect what's happening at the metropolitan area level, the metropolitan level. So as goes Sydney, so would go its neighborhoods, okay, in terms of decline, but not so in terms of upgrade, okay? That upgrading was not primarily a metropolitan level phenomenon, at least using the measures we could figure out. So that brings up the more interesting question, is maybe this upgrading and gentrification question is a bottom-up phenomenon, where a bunch of agents get together and they see an opportunity, maybe to make money or maybe to do something else, or maybe it's just a bunch of young people who want to move into a nice neighborhood because it has great potential. That could be it too. That's a bottom-up phenomenon. It's not because the regional economy is growing. It's because a bunch of people, individuals with free will, want to, get something they want, whether it's make more money or just live in a nicer neighborhood. And so that's an interesting question. And that brings up this whole idea of the rent gap. How many of you have heard of rent gap theory? Okay. Again, it's associated with this critical geographer named Neil Smith, and it's basically a Marxist theory, and it says a bunch of capitalists get together, they have access to better information, they see which neighborhoods are undervalued, okay, relative to what they could be. So they look and they sort of look at the city and they say, okay, this neighborhood should be, rents and prices should be a lot higher, but they're actually lower. So let's see if we can depress them further, come in, swoop up all the properties, improve the properties, and then classic argument, buy low, sell high, and make a lot of money. Okay? So basically, it's a bunch of smart people who have a lot of money, looking to make even more money, and they act very strategically over the space of the city. And that if you look at, and so this isn't a rising tide lifting all boats. This is a bunch of very smart people looking to make a lot of money, and if people end up being displaced or end up losing their homes, that's just too bad. This rent gap theory has been very controversial. There have been a bunch of tests of it, and it really hasn't worked out too well. Actually, I didn't do a great job explaining it. I think Gary Trudeau did a much better job explaining it in 1984. This is a classic Doonesbury cartoon. If any of you teach housing policy or community development, you should put this cartoon in your syllabus, okay? Because it's a great thing. I don't know if did you get Doonesbury here in Australia? What? No? Okay. Anyway, it started out as a leftist comic strip in the anti-war comic strip in the 1960s. It's now sort of a yuppie type thing. Anyway, here we have Mark Slackenmeyer on the left, and who's the radio talk show host. This is when radio talk show hosts in America were liberal. This is 1984. Now they're only conservative, but once upon a time they were liberal. And he's talking to Dr. Dan, who's explaining gentrification. He says, could you explain how gentrification works? And Dr. Dan says, for sure, it works like this. A developer buys a dilapidated house in a depressed property. He fixes it up and resells it to a young middle-class couple. This encourages other gentry to buy into the neighborhood. Before long, a fantastic real estate market booms where none existed before. Then the radio host says, and what happens to low-income tenants? Who are they? Are they displaced? They don't care. And Dr. Ian says, sure we care. These people are very important to the whole process. And the host says, why is that? And Dr. Ian says, of course, they move on to devalue other properties in other neighborhoods so we can continue this process. And I thought, wow, that's a really clever interpretation. We need poor people to devalue properties so we can push them out and raise their values. I point out that Doonesbury, this comic strip came out in 1984. When I put this article on housing policy debate, I said to the editors, I want to include this comic strip. Nobody ever asked them to include a comic strip in housing policy debate before. And they said, fine, we'll do it. You have to get the rights. And so I was thinking, oh my gosh, they're going to charge me. The syndicate that owns this is going to charge me like $10,000 for the rights. But it turns out that this was so long ago, it cost me $10. I now have the unlimited rights to use this comic strip, and that means I can send the PDF to you, and you can use it as well. Anyway, that's sort of rent gap theory quickly. So we can look at a lot of these bottom-up measures, the measures at the local level of the census tracts, and see to what extent they are associated with the likelihood, the probability that a tract, that's the top, the probability that a tract changes between 1990 and 2000. Again, the tract can do one of four things. It can not change, it can decline, it can upgrade, or it can gentrify. So there are four possibilities for the tract between 1990 and 2010. Most of them didn't change, a good number of them declined, some upgraded, and a few gentrified. But since I've got 45,000 observations, statistically that's a lot, okay, I can do these pretty good tests. And I use something called a logit model for those, which is a probability model about discrete outcomes. Again, the outcomes here are not numbers, they're discrete outcomes. Decline, don't change, upgrade, gentrify. And we tested these various characteristics. The green is the characteristics of the population who lives there. So to what extent does the characteristics of the population who lives there in 1990 determine what's going to happen? The yellow is the characteristics of the housing market. So if the housing is old or new or high valued or low valued, what does that say about what's going to happen over the next 20 years? We did some characteristics of the locational characteristics and density characteristics of the tract. This is relative to the central business district. And lastly, we did some calculated measures which we constructed, one of which was our metropolitan effect. So we wanted to hold constant the metropolitan effect. And the second was this observed rent gap, the potential of a speculator to come in and raise the values by kicking out the current residents. So we tested all of these things, and we came up with these models, and I'm not going to go through them very much. Just to say, I'm going to highlight the ones that are in bold. If you want to understand which tracts were more likely to upgrade, the tracts, those are blue, were more likely to upgrade were those that started with a high rent, started with a relatively educated bunch of residents, started with a white population, but the incomes were lower. Okay? So basically, if you wanted to know what areas were likely to be upgraded in 1990, let's see, that's relatively high rent, relatively high college educated, relatively white college students. Okay? White college students neighborhoods who don't have a lot of total income, but they have some good relative income. Those were the neighborhoods in 1990, more likely to be upgraded. What were the neighborhoods more likely to be gentrified? That's in green. Again, relative high rent relative to the neighborhood, relative white, low absolute income. And what were the neighborhoods likely to decline? Those neighborhoods that started off a little too expensive relative to their incomes. Neighborhoods further away from the CBD, much more suburban neighborhoods, much more likely to decline. Neighborhoods that had both more single and more multifamily units. And some of these other things were statistically significant, although not that significant. Again, we did a much better job predicting decline than upgrading. So where does this leave me? In general, this leaves me with the conclusion that neighborhood decline, at least this period in most American cities, was reasonably predictable. We could figure out where neighborhood decline was going to occur, both as a function of macroeconomic forces and as a function of bottom-up forces. it's a lot harder to predict which neighborhoods are going to improve, and it turns out to be a lot harder to predict which neighborhoods are going to gentrify, which is, is a little frustrating if you're a modeler because you want to be able to predict all these things, but if you're a human being and you believe in free will and serendipity and luck and all these other things going on in the background, the idea that we can't really predict exactly what neighborhood is going to improve is actually quite reassuring. I mean, life would be pretty boring if we could predict everything. So that means that if you are potential gentrifiers, there are opportunities for you that I have not predicted. And that's the good side. The downside, I suspect, is that if you're going to be a victim of gentrification, it may be a bit of a roll in the dice as well. So lastly, let's come to this fourth question. To what extent are gentrification and other forms of substantial neighborhood change always accompanied by displacement of existing residents? Now, we don't do any measurement of displacement in the United States. It's really hard to measure because almost by definition, by the time someone has been displaced, they're out of your survey frame. So it's really hard to find them. Okay? But we do measure turnover, and that's the percentage of people who lived in the same house a year ago. So these are one-year turnover rates. So what percent of the people lived in the same house a year ago, or conversely didn't? And the group on the left is the highest turnover rates. The group on the right is the lowest turnover rates. So the places that have the highest turnover rates, the fewest number of people live in the same house. In Colorado Springs, 24% of the residents of Colorado Springs in 2010 lived in a different house a year ago, which is a high level of turnover. In Austin, Texas, it was 23%. Las Vegas, it was 22%. New Orleans, it was 22%. Columbia, South Carolina, was 21%. These are the high turnover rate cities. Okay? Now, turnover and displacement are not exactly the same thing. Displacement is involuntary turnover. Turnover is turnover. Displacement is involuntary turnover. But they're very highly correlated. Okay? These are low turnover places: Newark, Seattle, New Haven, New York City. Those are the places where people stick around year after year in the same house. So this sets up an obvious question. Are turnover rates higher in neighborhoods that are gentrifying or upgrading, or are they higher in neighborhoods that are declining? And you can build a theoretical story around each of those propositions, but we can test that. So here's what we found. Okay, if we just tested turnover rates as a function of whether a tract was upgrading or declining, that's this first set of columns in blue, we found that turnover rates were higher. There's the coefficient, and it's significant. Turnover rates were higher in declining neighborhoods. People were more likely to move out of declining neighborhoods. Okay, turnover rates were slightly lower in upgrading and gentrifying neighborhoods. Okay, people were slightly less likely to move out of upgrading and gentrifying neighborhoods, but it was only marginally significant. Again, we had about 42,000 observations, 42,000 neighborhoods. The overall model quality wasn't very good. And then if we said, well, instead of defining it in terms of the neighborhood, if we define it in terms of characteristics of population, because most of the reasons that people move are not related to their neighborhood, they're related to their personal circumstances. You're older, you have kids, you move to a different neighborhood, you graduate from college, you move to a different neighborhood, your house gets too difficult for you to move to a different neighborhood. Most of the reasons people move are not related to the neighborhood, they're related to their personal circumstances. Okay? So let's bring in those personal circumstances measured at the census tract level, and we do that. We bring in income, age, percent of single-person households, renters, employment rate. Those factors dominate, and the neighborhood change is not significant. Again, this isn't exactly displacement, it's turnover, but it suggests that the reason neighborhoods are turning over is because, for the most part, their residents are at points in their lives where they want to move or don't want to move. It's not because of what's happening in the neighborhood. So I'm almost out of time, so I won't summarize it, but let's just think about where this leads us. This is in the United States. Now remember, we have about 360 metropolitan areas in the United States. I'm only looking at 70 of them. So how do we want to think about policy guidance? And so I'm going to divide this into planners in our central core areas and planners in suburban areas, because they're slightly different phenomena. So if I'm a center city planner or a core area planner, and I'm seeking to promote neighborhood upgrading, I think upgrading is a good thing. I should focus our policies and our programs on older, walkable neighborhoods that have a diverse and upwardly mobile population. Those are the places that seem to be on an upward trend. Not really surprising. Other than the fact that gentrification starts from a lower starting point on the income scale, there are a few structural differences between upgrading and gentrification. Upgrading and gentrification are the same thing. It's just that gentrification starts at a lower level. Instead of trying to limit upgrade, this is the important point. Okay? If there's a takeaway from policy, it's this. Instead of trying to limit upgrading as a measure of deterring gentrification, instead of trying to get people to move out or get people to move in, instead of trying to stop that, local planners are better off trying to redistribute the benefits of gentrification. So gentrification is creating an increase in investment and increase in wealth. Can't we take some of that and give it particularly to low-income renters and either help them move to a better place if they want to move or help them stay if they want to stay? And it turns out in the United States we have a bunch of ways to do that. There's this thing called circuit breaker mechanisms where if your property tax goes up too much in a given year, you don't have to pay it. Okay? It breaks the circuit of rising property taxes. We can direct housing vouchers to low-income renters. In America, we have this thing called housing vouchers. I don't think you have them here, which are payments to low-income tenants to help them with their rent. We can direct them to low-income renters in these gentrified neighborhoods instead of making them first come, first serve. Or this is the most interesting thing. Given that there's a lot of wealth being generated, we can, by this, every time a property transacts and changes hands, they have to pay something called a transfer tax. It's similar to your stamp tax here in Sydney. So in the US, the transfer tax average is 1% to 2%. What's the stamp tax average here? It's about 5%? Higher? Lower? No, nobody bought or sold a house recently? What? What?
That's more like 2%.
2%? Okay. Okay. Well, you know, on $1 million, that's a lot. $1 million transaction, you know, that's a lot of money. Why not take some of that money and instead of just giving it to the government, because who knows what they'll spend it on, okay? Take some of that, and that money is being generated locally by the improvement in property values of that location. Take some of it, not all of it, some of it, redirect it back toward the neighborhood to help keep that neighborhood affordable to those people who are most at risk. Okay, and legally these things are possible to do in the United States. So this original idea that I started out with is, at least in the 1990s and 2000, gentrification was not a huge problem. It was broadly based, but it's not a huge problem. But where it mostly affected low-income renters. And there's been a lot of work to show that. We have policy vehicles to deal with that. We don't have to stop neighborhood change. We can think about encouraging it. And what about people seeking decline is a bigger problem. What about planners who are seeking to stem decline? They should keep their eye on neighborhoods that are vulnerable to decline. Those are more distant neighborhoods, those with proportionate more multifamily housing, and those with large poverty populations. So you overlay these characteristics and you can see the neighborhoods that are most likely to decline. So we have some predictive capacity there as well. Now finally, let me say that my original analysis ended in 2010. 2010 was when the recovery from the great financial crisis started. So what's happened since, at least in America, we started very slow recovery. But we started recovering from the great financial crisis. This just looks at uses the same method. Instead of applying it at metropolitan level, it applies it to counties. And it's pretty interesting because it finds that actually since the end of the financial crisis in America, gentrification has picked up quite a bit. Okay? So if the average before the financial crisis was 1% to 2% across most metropolitan areas, since the end of the financial crisis, the average gentrification population is now 4% to 5%. Here you can see category average 4%, category average 5%. These are different size cities. Here are the tops in each of those. So since 2010, the top gentrifying city has been Los Angeles, then Brooklyn, the one everybody talks about, then San Francisco, that's Oakland, Alameda, Fort Lauderdale, and Queens, which is another place. So the media is getting it right in terms of which are the big gentrifiers. But there's some other places that we don't think about gentrification. Tucson is a big gentrifier, turns out. Tampa is a big gentrifier, as it turns out. Denver is a big gentrifier. And we can see that as upgrading as well. So a lot of data, a lot of numbers. It's what you have. One of the nice things about Australia is what you only have 5 or 6